Good evening, everybody. Sorry we started a bit late, but it was because you were coming in. We wanted to give you a chance to get in, sit down, settle down. My name's Dan Smith. I'm Secretary General of International, and welcome to this, our latest in the series of peace talks. So welcome you to this meeting, which is co-hosted by by the Royal Commonwealth Society, where you're sitting, and Sussex University. We've been working together to put this on, and will be putting on other events during the course of the year. The topic tonight, as you know, which is why you're here, is war, peace and faith, the ambiguous role of religion in 21st century conflict. And as you can see, there are 4 people to discuss this issue with us, to open up for discussion, and then there will be plenty of opportunity for questions and comment, discussion from the audience. 4 speakers from here, Aaqil Ahmed, who's it says here, head of religion and ethics at the BBC. Does that really mean you're head of ethics at the BBC? This is a heavy burden. Aaqil was saying just before we came on that first sort of half of his career was in current affairs as an executive producer, and since 9/11, then it's shifted into this the field of religion and ethics. And a lot of the programs that you will have seen over the past 10 years on BBC or for period on Channel 4, this is the man who was and is behind us. Sitting next to Aaqil is Rama, who is an old friend and colleague with about 5 or 6 different institutional affiliations, one of which we put on the notice. But another one is at the Centre for International Relations, or Studies, Relations at the Oxford Studies at Oxford University, and also at the Geneva Centre for Security Policy. Next to Rama is Fabio Petito, who is a senior lecturer in international relations at the University of Sussex, and along and sitting opposite where I'll be sitting is Andrew Brown, who is the commissioning editor on issues of belief, and comment is free in The Guardian. So it's a tremendous lineup to be discussing this issue. We won't, I think, be producing any sort of absolute and firm, rock-solid answers to any of the questions we may be asking, but we will ask interesting questions, we'll explore them, we'll go into them, and then afterwards we'll probably carry on the conversation in more informal ways. The ambiguous role of religion in 21st century peace and conflict. Today, sanctions were lifted on Myanmar by the European Union. The criticism by human rights groups against that is based in part on footage which has just been aired, which was shot a month ago, of violence in the town of Mektila in the central part of Myanmar, not so very far from Mandalay, where I think the figure is that 43 Muslims were killed in an attack by Buddhist rioters on the Muslim area of the city. Also, just flicking around the BBC today, there's a report of the fighting in northern Nigeria between the Nigerian army and the Islamist organization, usually called Boko Haram, though its actual name is much longer and more complicated than that. There are disputes about how many people were killed. One figure that's been given is 185. Otherwise, people are saying scores of people have been killed, and large parts of the town where this was happening were being burnt down. The violence in Myanmar shocks very often simply because it's Buddhism, it seems to be. Actually, one of the most, you don't often read quantitative, large-end statistical studies in sociology and say, ooh, that's shocking. But one which I did was simply looking at the association between religion and wars since the end of the Second World War. Which are the countries which have the highest association with war? Or which religions have the highest association with war? Is there more war in Christian countries? Muslim countries? Israel? Jewish country? Hindu country? India? No, it's actually in the Buddhist country. The statistical association between the presence of a religion and the presence of war is highest in the case between Buddhism and war. And it's strange, and it's worth thinking about, because I think that many people, most people perhaps, would think of Buddhism as being, one of the most peaceful and perhaps the least materialistic of all religions, one might even say. So, to explore these issues, we have 4 people here to help us. And I'm going to turn, first of all, to Fabio Petito, who's a lecturer in international relations. And really, having set out a couple of questions like that, what I want to ask you, Fabio, is why are we here? What is the topic which we're trying to get our heads around? We'll probably disagree about what that topic is during the course of the evening, but let's start by trying to figure out what the topic is so that we've got some common ground, even if then we're going to diverge from it dramatically.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, thanks. The way I see it, let's say, I will try to look at the big picture. The way I see it.
No, it's okay.
The gentleman on the right is
okay. Sorry. Yes. The big picture, I would say. I think the first thing I would say is that in many ways, the word you have described, the title of our discussion is referring to, is a word that many scholars, analysts believe was not supposed to exist. In some way, we live in a world nowadays where religion has become much more visible, politics, that for many decades, the predominant view in social sciences was that modernization would bring secularization, and that would mean more or less that religion would become more privatized and less relevant and influential in the public sphere and politics. I think nowadays in the last 20 years, have started talking about the global resurgence of religion in international affairs, and that's the context. And that is a context also of the end of the Cold War. So it's really after the end of the Cold War that you have the first analysis that seems to suggest that religion was reacquiring a powerful political role in international affairs, very often a destabilizing role. And I would think of at least 3 ways in which analysts have described the role of religion in the post-Cold War context. First one, definitely, the role that religion was playing in the new politics of identity, which was proliferating in collapsing, failing states when the structure of the state was not anymore there. Groups were realigning along very often religious, ethnic, cultural lines, and religion seemed to play a very critical role in this new politics of identity. Think even of the war in the Balkans. Many argue it was about religious nationalism. The other way in which religion seems to have come again at the center stage of international politics, and not for good, of course, was religious terrorism. 9/11 sealed this, but also other Christian terrorism, Hindu nationalism, Hindu terrorism, and other forms of religious terror. But of course, 9/11 here was very critical. And the other, more macro scenario, unquestionably, was the one put forward by Samuel Huntington, which argued that the new conflicts would happen along the fault line of civilization, and at the heart of civilization, you had very often the great worldwide religious tradition. Now, I think in the last 20-25 years, we had a lot of readings of this kind. I have many problems with this reading, but I think it's a good way to get started to think that this is the kind of big picture we have as a reference.
So tell me one problem you have with that reading.
Well, I think many are based on a biased understanding of religions and on the kind of implicit secularist assumption that when you mix religion and politics, you get violence, instability, terrorism. I think this is more ideology than serious analysis in many ways. But I can say more about that.
Yeah, okay, so I'm going to give us some of the ideology. Is it, I mean, the role of religion in politics? Is it primarily negative?
Is it predestined to be negative? I love the way that you started that off. And indeed, I mean, what I find quite fascinating, just going a little bit to what you said about, we weren't expecting this to happen. We were all presuming that we were in this wonderful secular world. And I think about myself growing up in India, where religion was in your face in every aspect of life, and the fact that I live now in France, which is probably the last island of secularism left even in Europe. And the fact that already a year before 9/11, when Gallup tried to do a poll and figure out, well, are people religious? Does religion matter? They found that 87% of the world's population would have put up their hands and said, yep, I believe. That doesn't mean I show up in church or in the mosque on a regular basis, but I'm a believer. There's something up there and I'm in for it. And that's the whole demographics of religion. So to go to the question, because I guess, the media, and you'll tell us if this is true, has tended since already the end of the Cold War, since Samuel Huntington and since 9/11, to focus on the bad news. I guess that's what you have to do for the most part. It's so easy to look at this ideological position that religion leads to conflict and nothing else can be the outcome. So I have tried to really look at the other side and see all the kinds of initiatives from the very grassroots up to the big, wonderful interfaith peace initiatives, more and more of them that seem to be appearing and meeting with very good intentions. And sometimes they do have an absolute effect, I guess, like San Vigilio in Mozambique, or another one that you've been quite involved with in the very country you mentioned, Nigeria, where before Boko Haram became so prominent. In Kaduna, you had the imam and the pastor who were sworn enemies and were able to come together. In my own country, where I just despair at the very place I grew up, which was extraordinarily secular in the genuine sense, which is religion was for home and the community, but out there you didn't talk religion, well it was mixed, but it was a secular country, and you see what's happening now, and still there are extraordinarily positive interfaith initiatives at the grassroots level that really work. So I say that there are the two sides, but I find it extraordinarily paradoxical, and I have a whole series of reasons why, different than you, why I think we're missing the boat, because we're looking at the wrong things. And as usual, we don't look at some of the stuff that really matters.
So what would be the right things to look at?
The right things to look at would not be to always look there. You mentioned terrorism, and of course, when we look at terrorism, we look at, what were the terrorists targeting, rather than why were they targeting us. So I would say that looking at religion and this whole relationship with conflict, we would need to look much more at what the mainstream is doing, and not reflecting about, which creates an atmosphere of extraordinary belligerence and spillovers into violence.
Okay, well I want to come back to that in a minute and explore in a sense what you could call the balance sheet about religion and peace. But before doing that, Fabio referred in the remarks to the wars in the Balkans, and that religion somehow seemed to be in there. Many analysts seem to talk about them being wars of a kind of a religious nationalism. And I'm wondering whether or not, in fact, when you're talking about that, whether religion is really a useful or interesting thing to be talking about at all. That the differences between people that are played upon in that kind of conflict are much more broader cultural differences and are not really questions of faith. Aaqil, where do you come down in that argument?
Well, the obvious answer is it's more complicated. But I think that's definitely the case. Having been to the Balkans and been to many war zones when I was a producer, you can sense that it's obviously politics, and it's current politics which play a major part. And of course, nationalism doesn't have to be related to religion; it can be about many other things. But just recently, I've actually been, for the past year or so, I've been making a series for the BBC on the history and legacy and impact of the Ottoman Empire, and why there is this current desire in many parts of the world to to reinterpret the Ottoman Empire for various different people's own means, and the Ottoman Empire was probably one of the biggest, largest, and one of the most interesting multi-ethnic empires and states, and definitely with cities like Istanbul and Sarajevo, you have some and Jerusalem for that matter, you have some fascinating kind of moments in history. But what that has told us is actually what I experienced over 20 years ago in the Balkans, and to this day, in those particular places, they're still fighting wars of a religious nature. So when they talk about the Bosnians, you know, with people like me, and I'm sure for many people, when the Balkan conflict started, people would find it very weird that these people being referred to as Muslims. And when you met them 20 odd years ago, they were the only Muslims I met who ate pork and drank vodka copiously and didn't understand what Islam was about.
Apart from the Chechens, in my experience.
Well, the Chechens, and then after I had some interesting things about being in Mecca with some people from that part of the world who when I had flu, telling me, have some vodka, it'll make you feel better. I said, well, we're on the middle of Hajj, it might not be the right time. But what you experienced then was that and what I've experienced now with this project is that people go back to, when they're threatened with something that doesn't make sense to them, say whether it be the collapse of Yugoslavia, or whether it be with regards to fundamentalism in countries like India or in America, with modernism, when they kind of relate to something, then they go back to something that they feel very comfortable with. And the Ottoman Empire is a classic example of how people go back to finding the thing that they can fight against, that they can relate to. So for the Serbs, it's the Muslims who were coming in the guise of the Ottoman Empire, who came in and destroyed their country and enslaved their people and took them to the men and the women away, as young children, away from their villages to be used in the Ottoman court. So that, even though that happened hundreds of years ago, it's still relevant to them today because it's the thing that they can cling on to. And it's the same in India, it's the same in when you go to Israel and to Palestine. The arguments that people are having there are arguments which feel weird to if you were to come to it for the first time. But if you understand the mentality of people, you understand that, well, you know, that if you could be in Tel Aviv with people who have got absolutely no concept of Judaism, quite frankly, and they're having conversations with you about their need to be here based on scripture that I'm not even sure they've read since after their bar mitzvah. So in a sense, I think that religion is you can't get away from religion with regards to its relationship to conflict, but I feel in many cases it's there because it's easy for people to use, for good and for bad as well.
Yeah. Well, I want to hop up to Andrew with this, the question of the mentality which you raised. I mean, and this is something which Fabio brought out at the beginning. In this world which we sitting up here didn't quite expect, we thought we didn't even have to think about it. It was like, you know, not knowing that water has a taste until something goes wrong with it. We didn't think about secularism. You didn't have to think about secularism. Secular is what it was. And now part of what we're saying is that what we see is that this is no longer true. If it ever was true, but it's not true now. Do you think that there is, I mean, how misled were we? Is there something which is actually, if we get down to the core of it, something which is distinctly preferable about a secular approach? Is there something which is default mode from the point of view of a reasoning intelligence? Is there something which you could call almost natural about a secular mode of politics?
No. I mean, I think, for one thing, secularity is not a simple concept. There are lots of different secularities, and certainly in Europe and in the West, and in places where it's been taken as a political ideology, and I'm thinking of India and to some extent Israel here, all of these are clearly reactions to Christianity, and they're also not one simple reaction, but they're reactions to different forms that Christianity took politically in different parts of Europe. So I think that Scandinavian secularity is different from French secularity, which is much more. In all these cases, there's a reasonable argument that what you're seeing is a mirror image of particular styles of Christianity. In France, you have this tremendously powerful Catholic establishment which sort of regulated every part of people's lives. So when you get French secularism and laïcité, it similarly absolutely blanket denial of the importance of religion. And in Scandinavia, you have a much more complicated arrangement where almost everybody belongs, You know, I mean, rates in we've got established churches in Denmark and in Norway and until quite recently in Sweden. You don't think of these places as religious, but actually when you go there you discover that it's quite embedded, and we can see in things like the Danish cartoons that there is available a whole identification of yourself as Christian, as Christian, and as your country as Christian, which, like the taste of water, all of a sudden hang on, you know, who puts a Eucharist in here?
At the same time, you can be confirmed in humanism in those countries.
Oh yes,
In a
but
way
that's,
that you
but that's
be
exactly,
confirmed in Anglicanism.
you know, I sometimes tease people by saying that the British Humanist Association is just an Anglican heresy. It is. You know, it's, so secularism as a kind of doctrine of the state's neutrality in theological matters is very new, very unnatural. We can trace it back to Rhode Island and we can see various developments. It is constantly threatened, and most of the people who believe in it certainly don't believe that the state should be ethical and moral questions. Now, I think just as a matter of empirical observation, you don't hold people together around shared morality without having shared myths, shared stories. Now, whether you want to call these religious or not, I'm not desperately interested. I think that religion is now a toxic brand, if you like, which is a shame because there are lots of ways of thinking about religion that illuminate secularist or non-secularist. I'm very influenced in this because I lived in Sweden when it was a completely self-confident social democratic country in the late 70s and early 80s. And it was absolutely held together by two things people knew so deeply they didn't have to believe in them. And of course, all that has collapsed since then. And it's been quite fascinating to watch, at least from the outside. And it's one reason why I call the things it belief, because I'm interested in the things people don't even know they believe.
Right.
Sorry, that's all.
No, that's really good. I guess what I was tantalized by there for a moment in what you were saying was the idea of the narrative. That if you want to hold people together, whether as a nation, as a collective, as a town, as a meeting, you need some kind of, around some kind of moral values, you need some kind of story. And you said, religion is kind of a toxic brand. But secular nationalism's efforts to tell its historical narrative and invent the traditions that go, also, toxicity is almost the least charged as well as some of that.
Well, completely. Religions have at least the capacity to contradict themselves and to reinvent themselves. I think the flexibility of the religious imagination is enormously important.
Right.
But can I come back to violence for a moment? Because it's been a bit more difficult. One of the interesting things is the question of the secular assumption is that where there is religion, there will be violence. Now, it seems to me this is completely the wrong way around, and what we've actually learned is that where there is violence, there will be religion. You can see this very clearly in the developments in Israeli politics. They go out there all full of kibbutzim and they end up with Aradim. And one reason for this is precisely, surely, the irrationality of religion. Because in a secular kind of market-based economy, everything's everything's sort of contractual. You behave, everything's done on the basis of self-interest, and if it stops being in my interest to cooperate with you, well, it's not. Now that doesn't make me the kind of guy you want next to you in a foxhole. What I want if things have actually come to squatting in foxholes is somebody unconditionally loyal who doesn't sit around wondering, well, can I rationally defend what I'm doing? Picks up a bloody gun and shoots. And for this reason, if no other, once wars start, you get an upsurge in religious feelings simply because the side that can trust each other with least thought has got a huge moral and indeed practical advantage over the other side.
Fabio, do you think that association, that relationship works?
If I understand you correctly, and I'm not sure that I agree, because I think there is a lot of mythology around this idea of religious violence. The idea being that religious violence would be particularly intense and pernicious compared to other form of violence, political violence produced by other ideologies. I mean, I think the 20th century...
I certainly wouldn't.
Okay, so okay, sorry, so I probably... but I want to make this point, I think, because this issue of religious violence is absolutely essential and behind many of these kind of analysis that we got about, you know, we live in a very stable, irrational, international system, also because religion is gaining more power, and religion, you know, this dichotomy between rationality and religion and irrationality. I think we need to understand that this is very much a construction that was produced exactly through the sort of process you were referring to, you know. There was, if you look at Europe, there were very massive struggles between the liberal nation state and the church, and part of this struggle, of course, was to denounce each other as irrational and more violent than each other. So, and we have forgotten this history at some point, and we have just remained with this idea that there is something very pernicious and intense in terms of religious violence. But I want just to invite you to think about the kind of political violence that we had on a mass scale in the 20th centuries. And we can clearly see that much of this political violence was of secular ideological origins, whether it was, you know, Nazism, Stalinism, and arguably, you know, even the defense against of liberal values took the form of extremely intense political violence with Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So I want just to suggest that, you know, I think this idea of religious violence as an assumption is deeply problematic. We need really to understand what political violence is based on, and this is about understanding politics in many ways. And the final point, if I can, I actually think that when you have religious violence or religious-inspired political violence, because you actually have something which you don't expect, which is that normally religious violence is facilitated by religious ignorance. So it's not because you have strong religious identity that this produced strong political commitment and violence. In the case of Balkans, it's very interesting. I once interviewed a Bosniak Muslim woman. She told me, you know, for 50 years they told us we were all atheists. And in a couple of days they told us, you know, you're Muslim, you're Catholic, you're Protestant. We thought, what does it mean? We don't know. Well, you're Muslim means you don't like the Catholics. The Catholics don't like the Orthodox. You know, it's when there is very a vague understanding of religiosity that the political entrepreneur can intervene and say what religion is about. If you have actually more religious knowledge, you maybe have the capacity to oppose this sort of religious instrumentalizations.
So, Rama, I was going to ask you, as I mentioned, coming back to sort of a balance sheet, I was going to ask you to sort of count up in your head, and option A is religion is good for peace, and option B, religion is bad for peace, and tell me which you would tick. But I presume from what I just heard that that's a fake question.
It may be fake, but maybe if I just pick up one thing which, I use the word bothered me, but definitely struck me in what you said, Andrew, I may be able to come towards an answer, and you picked up on it, which is, you know, on the one hand, you talked about the wonderful thing about religion is its capacity to reinvent itself, right, to think about itself, and then you went on to say, well, come on, you know, rationality surely has a lot of extra points over the religious option, or did I get that wrong? It could be that my ears are still popping from my flight, but what I mean to say is, and you also, you know, earlier you said that, what was it about? The shared values, to have a shared ethic, you need to have a shared story. So there were these kind of slightly contradictory positions, but let me just go to the one that you mentioned about religion's capacity to reinvent itself. And I think that the reason we've come today to having this hard time answering your question is what we hold to be religion today is, like you said, it's actually this bundle of ignorance. It's this thin little veneer of something which used to be this vibrant, constantly self-renewing, and when it got corrupted like dirty water, you'd say, oh, I'm not going to drink this dirty water, I'm going to clean it up. How do I clean it up? I've got to think about it, I've got to think about myself, I've got to think about all of that, and if I don't reinvent myself, I'm going to lose. People are not going to drink the water, they're going to go find another well or another river or whatever. So the fundamental part of every religious tradition was self-reflection and critical inquiry, which led to the capacity to reinvent itself. We have lost that.
We have lost that.
Religions, I mean, society, human beings have lost that. And I think part of it is this danger of believing we've become rational, where even in that rationality, we can get into that, the coldness of rationality. And I'm not arguing with you, I was just taking that one sentence that you said and using it to try to respond to Dan's question, which is, therefore, because we are left with this thin veneer, where we accept someone coming along wearing the white clothing which looks vaguely familiar and authoritative, who seems to be slightly more moral than the corrupt politician, or if the corrupt politician dressed up and using the language that you're able, well, unfortunately, or being blessed by and sanctified, and I can see people in, from countries or with origins that know exactly, what we're talking about, that therefore we have a balance sheet which is quite upsetting. Because when you have this reduced version of religion, it is darn easy to stir up violence. And the reason why there is so little space for the self-reflective, the ijtihad. I was thinking, for example, if you take, Sri Lanka, we think about this crazy thing like the Bodu Bala Sena, which is, Buddhists being an army, which reminds me of the Shiv Sena in India. I mean, how can you have, an army in the name of God, of religions which are profoundly, believe in nonviolence and in the oneness of all? You can, because you absolutely destroy anyone who reflects critically.
I want to come back to Aaqil and Andrew, and then maybe with a little bit more summing up between the panel. Then I'm going to open out for people in the audience. So kind of start thinking what your questions are going to be. But Aaqil, was Rama being fair to religion there? This thin veneer, chaos underneath, balance sheet, therefore.
As long as it remains like this, the balance sheet will be bad, unless we go to a deeper understanding of religion.
I suppose the short answer is there's been war in the name of religion since day one. So effectively, I don't know when this grand belief existed. So that's what you could say if you're taking that's what the new atheist approach. You say, well, hang on a second, let's talk about the Crusades. Let's talk about. We could go on and on and on. Exactly. We could go on and on. So I think there is an issue. There is an issue about how religion can be used, and I think it always will be used because the vast majority of people actually do have religious knowledge, and that's the reality. And I don't think that's ever going to change. The issue with regards to all of this, I think, ultimately comes down to. People, when they are threatened, they'll look for anything. And anybody who's travelled throughout the whole of Europe will know that people are very religious, historically and culturally. Whether it be Scandinavia or whether it be Eastern Europe or Central Europe, there's a lot of religiosity which seems to just get lost. Whenever people, if you think about the earlier and mid-20th century, whether it be Eastern Europe or Germany or all those countries, they found it very easy to turn their back on faith and to go down a road which many people would find very hard to understand what kind of road they went down then. And I think the problem that we have now in our own little world that we're living in today is there's this whole thing about a lack of religious literacy. So when we talk about this, I don't believe there's ever been a great period where the vast majority of people actually knew much about religion anyway. Because if that was the case, we'd not be where we are today in all the countries in the world. But the problem that we have today in terms of how you can use religion in this particular era where we have mass communication and we have the ability to get your message across nations very quickly is that because of this lack of religious literacy, or from people who are religious and from people who do not follow religion, because of that vacuum, which has already existed, I believe, but because you can now throw things around very quickly, it's very easy to turn people onto a particular subject and make them think that conflict is the only way forward, or that conflict is the only connection that you can have to a subject.
Sure.
So if you use the example of, say, I was one of those teenage people who watched what was happening in Lebanon in '82, and like a lot of people, probably of left-wing persuasion, was active in the Nicaraguan solidarity campaign, the Palestinian solidarity campaign. I was one of those people who was involved in Students for Palestine in the mid-'80s. I went to see Pauline Cutting when she, and raised funds for her. There was no religion involved then.
No.
And the fact of the matter is, the vast majority of people on our Palestinian solidarity campaign were Jewish. This is in Manchester, because these were people who believed in human rights. And they believed that the human rights of these people were being infringed in Lebanon. We were talking about Lebanon, actually. None of us even talked about the West Bank or Gaza then, because it was being suppressed, or it was happening, whatever. But it was all about Lebanon. And now, because of the era we live in, because of this lack of this religious illiteracy, and the fact that we have satellites, and you can listen to some cleric who's got absolutely no idea what it is often he is talking about, we're now in a situation where the equivalent of that young Aaqil Ahmed in the mid-'80s is now switched on to a more conflictual form of religion and identity.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that you've got in there as well is this issue of vulnerability. That when people are in some ways under pressure, there's some kind of answer, some kind of comfort, some kind of certainty or security which can be given. So is part of what you're saying that comparing now to 30 years ago, that we live in a world which is generating more vulnerability, uncertainty, rising expectations and then crushing them, and so on. Is that part of what lies behind the issues, the reason that we're looking at these issues today, or is that too big a generalisation? Thank you.
It's probably quite a big generalisation. Simply, I think the fact that you can, something happens in one part of the world and you know about it, and there's no kind of. I mean, I have commissioned over in the last 10 years or so between 20 and 30 hours of programming about suicide bombing and terrorism. My bosses at Channel 4, where all of that was done, not the BBC, and that's quite a lot in a 6-7 year period. There was a time when they would say, surely there's nothing more to say, and there was always something to say. And the reason for, and now it seems obvious, but I remember the first series of The Cult of the Suicide Bomber, when we did, it was a history of suicide bombing, that's what it was. And there were people who would, when I would get up to speak, I'd be invited to speak at various festivals and give lectures, and people would get up and turn their back in certain places, because they didn't feel you should be talking about this.
Yeah.
And whereas now it seems like an obvious thing to do, but actually we need to know more, because I think there is this lack of religious literacy is for everybody, and not just the religious literacy about what people believe or how to talk about what people believe, but actually about when you use terrorism or when you use religion in the name of terror and conflict and warfare. We need to know what's really going on, and it goes back to what Fabio said as well, which is, when we talk about suicide bombing, the vast majority of it until 9/11 was actually Sri Lanka. Yeah. And also, so if you wanted to really get down to the technicality of who were the kings of suicide bombing, it's the Tamils and it's the Lebanese. And none of them are doing it in the name of religion.
I want, thinking of the balance sheet which I was talking about earlier, I want to head across to the other side of the balance. I want to mention the name Archbishop Tutu to begin with. So, in a sense, Andrew, I want you to talk about a little bit about the idea that all of the great religions have peace as a primary objective, and in their ethics and in their values, not just peace in a future life, but peace on earth. So where does that fit into this tale that we're telling? Because at the moment, if you were to talk about, creating a narrative which will bind people together in a certain moral universe, and you thought that this is the group of people who we're trying to do it with, then we're heading in a distinctly secular direction with the narrative that we've been developing so far this evening. So hold us in the other direction for a moment, if you will.
Well, I'm trying to, but I think my first problem with what you say, you talk about all the great religions, but there is clearly nothing in religion itself which says that peace is desirable. I mean, well, the Viking religion was certainly religious, it didn't have. And I think that any of us who have talked to, devout people in conflict zones have noticed that for many of them, peace is a condition that follows victory, it doesn't replace it. So I see this as part of the flexibility of religion, that many of, by no means all, but as you say, that Buddhism, Hinduism, the Abrahamic religions do have a vision of peace, do think it's desirable. They don't think on the whole that it's worth any price. I mean, most Christians are not Quakers. And I think this I wanted to defend religion as defend big religions as generally peacekeeping. I'm saying it's because they're able to do so because they enlarge our sympathies, as it were, artificially, so that if you are a white Christian South African, you have at least the possibility of feeling that you have more in common with Archbishop Tutu than with, I don't know, Richard Dawkins or Osama bin Laden. And this, although certainly the Abrahamic religions, or certainly Islam and Christianity have this idea of having more in common with your fellow believers than with anybody else, and this makes them uniquely suited, I think, to prospering inside empires, which also loosen them inside fairly capitalist societies, which again loosen traditional bonds. They mean you can trust, if I'm a businessman in Romania, I can trust a Ukrainian who's another fundamentalist in a way that I couldn't trust a Romanian next door. And all that tends to spread peace because it widens your set of sympathies. But on their own, no, I don't think, I think they provide resources. That's all. There's nothing inevitable.
Fabio, and then we'll go.
In every respect, disagree. Because I think, if you look at all the great worldwide religious traditions, from Islam to Christianity to the Judaism and the East Asian, actually peace is very much one of the key attributes of God. In fact, peace is the name of God in all this great world. And this is, I don't think, is something of no consequences in some way. I mean, we all completely right. I mean, there is an ambivalence or an ambiguity. And I'm not here to defend the fact that a lot of violence has been committed also in the name of religions. However, I think we often forget, even in the 20th century, that not only some of the greatest efforts at reconciliation and peace building, like the South African post-apartheid peaceful transition, was very much inspired by someone like Desmond Tutu, and also creatively imagined to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission as a kind of religious-inspired engagement. And I want to mention also Mahatma Gandhi here. You mentioned, of course, India is a secular country, but, the Nehru tradition wasn't good.
One of the kinds of secular.
But what Gandhi would have said, to this, Gandhi believed, of course, that all his political engagement was based on his spiritual life, and the very notion of non-violence, and of which he was one of the keys apostles, was based on this. And what about Martin Luther King in terms of civil rights movement? I mean, of course, this has been another great personality. So I'm stressing this because very often we forget that, of course, religion can be used for violent political purposes, but it has been very important in terms of civic engagement, even democratization. What in Europe we often, very often forget is that two countries which were more affected by totalitarian Nazi-fascist experience, Italy and Germany, were able to move to a transition to democracy, something which was not easy at all, through the creation of Christian democratic political parties. It's this kind of combination of political engagement inspired by a religious tradition. So we don't need, we tend to forget, and I think it's part of the problem I mentioned at the beginning. We have this default position, which we think, no, religion and politics is bad. But I think that's very empirically problematic.
Right. I want to just hang a question in the air, and anybody who's going to come back to it in a minute, and then ask for people in the audience to start kicking in. And the question is this: was what Fabio was just saying the same as saying that religion provides resources that can be used in conflict, and religion provides resources that can be used for good and peaceful purposes? And in this sense, there ain't nothing really special about religion. Take a question here. I saw your hand going up very early. There's a microphone coming towards you so that you can be heard.
To follow exactly this question, my question to the panel is: to what extent triumphant secularism? We can put some of the blame for this resurgence of these more ethno-confessionally violent forms of religion on triumphant secularism of the 70s, 80s, and the 90s, when religious elites were consistently ignored or sidelined during important sort of peace negotiations. Let's say in the 90s in post-Oslo, the Abrahamic religious elites were consistently ignored and sidelined during discussions of the basically division of the Abrahamic homicides in the Holy Land. So in a way, this smacks triumphant, self-confident secularism and its consistent sort of sidelining of religious elite in these 3 decades in particular. To some extent, I think we may put some of the blame on this particular attitude.
So I think that's a good question to start with. Take the microphone back towards the back of the room, if that's okay, and we'll pick somebody from the back next time. I think that's a good question to start with. Is it a backlash? Because this is quite important, because if it's a backlash, there's a hidden presumption in there, is that what swings one way can swing back the other way. Do you think this is backlash that we're dealing with? Rama, you wanted to get in this.
I want to go on something else, if someone wants to respond exactly on that, because I think there were several things that came up there and what you said that I felt. I think that one, I would underline what you said, Fabio, that it's the essence of religion, of all the religions is peace. And let's keep in mind that now Christianity is no longer a Western European religion predominantly. Most Christians live in the south of the world, and likewise, Islam, which is 25% of the world's religious population. Many of the Muslims are in the southern continents, where, because the pre-existing religions or spiritual traditions was so much based on peace and ways of conflict resolution and the sense of Ubuntu, since you mentioned Desmond too, to the sense of interdependence. So I think it goes deeper than peace. It's actually what comes up is this fundamental understanding that humanity is about unity, and it goes beyond just human beings. We are also united with our environment, which came through us for thousands of years before the extraordinary recent emergence of the Judeo-Christian tradition is like the last stage in our human evolution, but it's building on these tens of thousands of years of religious and spiritual traditions which are much more based on interdependence, a sense of unity with each other, with our differences, and with nature.
Okay.
And that was, so I just think it's an important thing to keep in mind.
Stop it there.
But I
Aaqil, or do you want to quick? The backlash question.
Sorry, yes, okay.
I think obviously there is a backlash, but I think the backlash is more because in terms it's a backlash against a number of things. It's, if you think about Christian fundamentalism, it goes way back to the early 20th century. So it's not. I don't think. I think yes, there is definitely in terms of aggressive secularism had a large part to play, and there's backlash against that. But if you look at fundamentalism, primarily the Middle Eastern Islamic fundamentalism, a lot of that goes back towards, you can look at the early uprisings of the Ikhwan in Saudi Arabia in the late 19th, early 20th century, but of course a lot of it is post-Sayyid Qutb in the 1950s, 40s, 50s onwards. So I think it's so complicated. I personally can't say that it is a backlash. I think I agree with you that things swing around, but I think that when you look at fundamentalism and religion being used for conflict in the period that we're in now, I think it's definitely a 20th century invention. But I think but each individual one has its own particular reasons for existing. And when you look at India or you look at other parts of the world, a lot of it's to do with this failure to come to terms with how society has moved in particularly the Western world, and its impact that then starts to have in other parts of the world as well.
Can I follow up on this? I think there is a very important issue there, because I think we need to go back to the end of colonialism and imperialism. And when many of these countries in the non-Western world became independent, the ideologies and the form of state that were predominant were either a form of secular nationalism or socialism.
Right.
And this was very important. These models were in some way constructed and I don't want to use because imposed, because many times were the elites who had studied European capitals that went back, and various, what we have seen recently in the Arab world is still part of the end of this story, this leader coming and studying European capitals, going back with this new idea, nationalism, socialism, and try to build society, and failing to deliver the project of secular development and democracy. And it's in that context that religion becomes something very new politically. It was Régis Debray, the French intellectual friend of Che Guevara, who fought with him in Latin America, was rescued by François Mitterrand in the 80s, and then recently wrote, we all thought that religion was the opium of the people. Actually, it's been the vitamin of the weak. In other words, what he's saying, religion becomes the only source of a new form of search for cultural authenticity. It was about, we had tried all this model which didn't belong to us. Now we go back to our indigenous tradition. And that's how you explain the rise, in my view, of political Islam, the return also to Hindu nationalism, the reference to Asian values. It's part of new form of politics, which is very important. And religion is critical to that. And so I think we're very right.
We've got there's a hand at the back there.
Thank you. I'd just like to come back to the religious literacy question, because I think it's quite a key point, and you talked about it very well, I thought. Aaqil, I think it was you in particular, we're talking about religious literacy and globalization, and the processes of globalization creating problems. But I'd like to just ask where religious literacy, this problem with religious literacy came from, because it seems to me that actually it could quite possibly be a result of the processes of globalization in itself, with the immediacy of information, with the media-driven kind of world that we live in, which is very much connected to stories and individuals rather than kind of scholarly debate. People have lost what Rama, you were talking about, the kind of depth in their religion. And we see scholars wheeled out on the BBC and other media programmes and so on. And there's just this lack of in-depth debate and discussion. I just wondered, my question is, does the media need to kind of facilitate, in this media-driven landscape, does the media need to facilitate the reopening of that scholarly debate, reopening the gates of Ijtihad and the equivalent in all these things, or is there a wider responsibility there?
Or is it absolutely impossible? Andrew?
Well, quite. I don't think it's anything that the media can do. If I look at religious literacy in the sense that it seems to me to have been lost quite a lot in British time. You can see it in cultural echoes. I have perhaps a an old-fashioned schooling. But, you know, things like the prayer book was simply part of life. This was not like before television or whatever, but you had chapel, you had services, you had a whole language that, again, it was something you didn't know you believed in many respects. You didn't believe it, but you knew it. And that's not something which the media can replace. The sense of ritual and of shared cultural reference and of shared ways of understanding who you are, which for my generation was something, you know, had something to do with Christianity, had something to do with hours of discomfort and tedium spent in chapels and so on and so forth. People 20 or 30 years younger than I am have children's television as their reference point. It's, you know, I don't see that any amount of highlighted programming or, you know, little cultural slots in the newspapers are going to do anything to restore that sort of religious literacy. The most you can possibly hope to do is make people understand that they do in fact believe certain things. We're coming back to, you know, that there is water all around them, even if they can't taste it.
It's been my life for the past 12 years. I think one part of the problem is religion and society has changed. And without going over the old ground, we now know that, you know, religion hasn't died. So effectively, you know, you have over the past 7 to 8, 10 years, you've had academics, you know, this realization that there's not enough knowledge about religion. In terms of, you've had the last 5 years, you've had the Religion and Society program, which was all about trying to get more people in who can train to become academics in the world of religion. You've had the experiment that my kids have gone through with religious education being compulsory, and to the extent that my daughter's taken a GCSE in it and wants to do A-level in religion. And you know, my generation, who went to high school in the early 80s, you know, we did religion for 2 years and dumped it straight away. And I think that experiment that they're doing now is actually, I believe, an attempt to give us a 21st century form of religious literacy, which is, it's more about cultural religious literacy. You need to know about what's happening around you. You need to know the basics. You need to know what Hindus believe in, what Muslims believe in, etc. Because your family aren't telling you this. Society is no longer telling you. It doesn't know anything about the literacy about Christianity, let alone the religious literacy or knowledge base that you have to have in a multicultural, multi-ethnic society. And so therefore that's what schools are doing, and doing it really well from my experience. And I think that experiment that we're living in, whether it be academia or schools or the kind of programs, I mean, I'm commissioning everything now for today, but also for tomorrow, because, you know, if I wanted to get really boring about learning journeys, etc., people will be how we access television today is very different to everybody here who accessed it when they first discovered television. And how we will access television tomorrow will be online, and it will be, I want to know something about Islam, and I want to watch something now. So that's why we made The Life of Muhammad, that's why we made The 7 Wonders of Buddhism, that's why we made The Story of the Saki, or all these kind of programs. They work today, but I know full well that in a few years' time, that will be something which people, whether in this room or the next generation that come along, that will be the way of accessing information on the face. And I don't want to be the person blamed in years to come as the guy who didn't quite get what was around the corner. So I think, yes, religious literacy is important, and the media does have a part to play, not to kind of like dictate to people, but to feed into this general acceptance that we need to know a little bit more. Not everybody will ever learn everything, but for those of you that are interested to go on this journey, whether it be at school, later on, or through accessing the media, to get more information, we have to deliver something for them.
Sorry, I just wanted to pick up, you said we could teach religious literacy in terms of learning what Hindus believe, what Muslims believe, and so on and so forth. I think this is quite impossible. We can teach people what Muslims do, what Hindus do, what the rituals are. But what we should be trying to do is teaching them how they believe, not what the story is, because you take the story out of context, you take the doctrine out of context, and it's just ridiculous.
So, but having helped my daughter revise for her in GCSE, and that's exactly what they are doing. Because it's not just about tell me what, just give me this definition of what is Hinduism. It's then about, so why, what does this tell you about the Hindu society? What does this tell you about the Hindu family? And that was one example. And then she was also doing about the afterlife in Christianity. And it wasn't just tell me what Christians believe, it was why and how different is it from others and word is this. So it's religion and philosophy. That's what they do.
There's one here, just in front of you. Right.
Yeah, I was very interested in what you were saying about religious ignorance. Is the problem not something to do with literalism and the way when we learn facts about religion, we learn literal truths which may not be the essence of what those different religions believe at all. So if you learnt the facts about, you know, the scriptures, you may come to a form of religion which is very far removed from those who live the essence of the religion, which is something quite peaceful. So it not only needs to be about learning facts, but learning the experience of the religion. And the British Museum's exhibition on the Hajj, I found absolutely brilliant, because suddenly you could enter into that experience of pilgrimage, entering into the experience of Mahatma Gandhi and Satyagraha, the idea that the essence of a faith has a peace, has a power of all of its own. And in the Christian faith, the idea that the gift of the risen Christ is the gift of peace, which overcomes all the literalism which has been used to put him to death. So it's only when we can get past the literalism of every faith that we begin to discover the essence of what faith is about.
We'll take another question or two along with that. There's one there, and just raise your hand a bit higher. Yes, and then bring it down here. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I have two questions, or perhaps two comments, and I would like to see the reaction of the panel. The first one is that I think there is a lack of specificity here. I think that where there are political conflicts, religion can play a very big role in order to try to solve that political conflict. In the case of Colombia, for example, the Catholic Church plays a very important role in building peace laboratories, what they call. But in other conflicts where religious is the dispute, like I guess in Northern Ireland in the 1980s, there is a bit more difficult the role that they can play. And then politics needs to play a different role of political parties. And I'm also thinking in South Africa. So I would like to see what you think about that, because I think that specificity is important. And the second one has to do in terms of this idea of religious lack of religious literacy. Because I was really convinced by the idea that there is nothing special about religion. And I think that what is, you are not gonna ensure that there is not gonna be a conflict if there are more people that know about religion, if they still feel some grievances. So I think it's more about the grievances as such that need to be taken into account. Thank you so much.
Store these up and down here at the front. Depending on the time, I've got my eye on the clock, and depending on the time, this might be the last question.
A couple of points. I'm very interested in this concept of religious literacy and the lack of it, because I think there is an overall lack of literacy in a whole lot of fields. There's also a lack of political and economic literacy. And I think that these interact. And what's at the root of all of those is an inability to think about complex issues and just having to react quickly to all sorts of stuff that comes in. We're not an informed society, we're a data overloaded society, and that makes it very difficult to deal with the complexities of religion and politics and economics and all sorts of other things. And so I think that's an issue that needs to be addressed. And religious organizations, churches, religious communities and other faith traditions can make a contribution to that. And one of the contributions they can make is actually coherence in the way that they live their beliefs. Andrew said earlier that not all Christians are Quakers. Well, I am. And one of the things that a peace-loving religion, a religion that has peace at its root, should not do is to support war. That seems to me self-evidently obvious, and I think any peace-loving religion that isn't pacifist is just inconsistent. And I think we need to address that. And I think that is one of the areas where dealing with conflicts is at the root of what the problem is. Because if people see religions preaching peace and doing war, then they're going to do war. And I think that the last comment I want to make is on the point of religion being the vitamin of the weak. Well, it's the vitamin of the weak if it's pro-poor and pro-justice. And unfortunately, the fundamentalist versions of a variety of religions we're dealing with today are neither.
Okay, well, we've got a quite significant bag full there to try to literalism and the need to get past the facts into really the experience of religion in order to understand it. This interesting point about political conflicts and religious solutions, religious conflicts and political solutions, there's a nicely brought out paradox there, well worth looking at. The role of grievance, which took us then into this question of literacy, and that's sort of what I've noted down here is it's not literacy, it's a general problem of thinking. And perhaps, I show my own age when I say that I think we live in relatively speaking, unreflective times. There seems to me to be less time for thinking than my parents had. Whether they did better with that time that they had, I don't know, that's another question. Then, an issue which must come out when one discusses any kind of moral philosophy is the consistency and the coherence, the practice, what you preach. Whether it's about violence or it's about justice and so on. So there is a quite big bag full, and I think we'll take the canter through it in the order that we started. Don't feel you have to be comprehensive, Fabio. No, there'll be one last question after this.
There are a couple of things I want to pick up on. One is, of course, the issue of specificity is very important. I think the problem is that, when you deal with religion, it's not that you're always dealing with politicized religion. So in both cases you mentioned, it's either a religious actor taking a political role or some political actors being inspired by religion. So the issue is always much more complex, and we need more to understand this complexity. Of course, I don't believe that it's all about grievances. Otherwise, religion will not be politically relevant. The fact is that it's not irrelevant. It's not irrelevant that grievances are shaped by religious discourse. In other words, it's not irrelevant that Osama bin Laden, was socialized in this particular religious ideology that he was. Now, the question becomes the following for me. Okay, so the question is, what kind of religiosity seems to produce more violent political behavior, and what kind of religiosity seems to be more conducive to peaceful or political engagement? Or under which conditions religion can be mobilized in one sense or the other? So these are the kind of interesting questions that we need to ask. And one just possible, I'm not going to answer them, they are too complex, but I think one thing that we need to understand, in my view, is that we thought for too much time that strong religious identity are more likely to generate strong, aggressive political behavior. I would want to argue that it's exactly the opposite. It's when you have weak, fragile, uncertain religious identity, which very often are not transmitted by the normal chain of transmission in the family or tradition. Look at the profile of all these religious terrorists of Al-Qaeda. Were they raised in particularly religious families? No. They were very middle class, secular in their upbringing. Many of them studied scientific subjects, always very dangerous sometimes. But at some point they went through a radicalization process. They meet a radical preacher who told them religion is 1, 2, 3. And for a series of reasons, so in other words, I think this radicalization process tells us something very interesting about the kind of religious identity which seems to be more prone to violent political behavior. There is more that I can say, but I think this is just something I wanted to stress.
Good. Rama?
Great, that follows really well, and I really enjoyed those questions very much, because I think you really put the point on it by emphasizing, as you did back there, about the difference between talking about the cultural thing of what people might do and the essence of the experience, and then moving straight on to what you said as a Quaker about coherence. It kind of comes to the question you're asking is what kind of religiosity and what kind of conditions lead to what kind of outcomes. And it would seem that when we go with people who rest with the essence and wish to be coherent or aligned, where what they say and what they do and what they think and what they feel and what they experience is actually coherent, you will get outward behavior and societies which have a propensity towards peace. Whereas when they go with the fundamentalists, they tend to take the rituals and hold on to the book. Who cares what's inside the book, but I have to preserve the book, and I will kill anyone. And that became kind of a justification which came much after the fact, and one of the extenuating circumstances, whether it's just war theory or anything else. And it was a great point. I mean, when we talked about this conversation, you asked the Colombian gentleman back there, the specificity, and we did think we'd be talking about lots of specific cases, but of course every case is specific. And immediately I think about all the cases across Latin America, and the very fact that liberation theology re-legitimized Christianity, which had such a bad name, because all that the elite was doing, and it comes back to your question right at the beginning, was cuddling up with power. What's going to be good for me? Where am I going to make a faster buck? Is what the religious elites of all religions, not just Christianity, were thinking. Think about, you referred, the Vatican during the Second World War and all of that. But when it was the people which were asking questions like you asked and saying, hey, where's the coherence? What about my grievances? Don't give me the book answer, the superficial answer, but really speak to my grievances in a way that I experience something. Then you had a transformation. And I would say, when you ask the question about backlash, it goes below that, yes, some war entrepreneurs have manipulated religion in the very thin sense, the fundamentalist sense. Whereas when the people have actually been mobilized, there's been more often a movement towards peace. And I think again of the case of Sri Lanka, where you have this Bodhu, Balasena, this army of the Buddhists. And it's that, you don't find it written about NBC or The Guardian. The war is over, we couldn't care about Sri Lanka. But the civil society is saying, no way, not in our name. That's not what Buddhism is about. And likewise in India, when the Shiv Sena starts distributing knives to women, saying, yes, we are against violence against women, so we're going to distribute 20,000 knives so women can defend themselves. It's civil society that says, no way, not in our names. So I think that the specificity is incredibly important, and when you have the people being involved in redefining religion according to the essence and the experience and the coherence, you will not have violent outcomes. And whenever you have the elites picking up the book and having no clue, like you said, about what's inside it and what it really means, what the stories actually mean, not taking them as fact, then you will have violence.
Okay, back to you.
Well, I think the literal issue is a very good one. And it goes back, when we talk about religious illiteracy, it's worldwide as well. It's not just in Britain. And it can take very different forms. And so that kind of diversity of faith that would have existed in a different era no longer is slowly being eroded. So the kind of the living of faith that you talked about, that means it seems to be it's dying in various different countries, and there are a number of reasons. Whether it be in one particular faith, you have certain countries which have the ability to spend huge amounts of money and bully countries and people within those countries to accept their form of a religion, and it goes on and on and on in various different forms. So that diversity of faith goes away. So the only faith that we really ever see and hear, and the growth and one that's growing, is the one which basically is the one we don't want to talk about, quite frankly. That's the problem. And so therefore there's no getting away from that. And it's not media's fault, or it's not even the average person's fault. It's a product of a number of things: money, power, and I suppose, and again that immediacy that the media gives it. And I think that's the issue that when we talked about. You're right. I mean, you know, as somebody who studied economics and politics, I completely agree with you. Nobody has a clue about politics. In fact, I can't remember half the things I studied because we never use them anymore, do we? They're not really relevant in society. But I think that you know, that doesn't mean that we don't have to find a new language. And it's not that we have to hark back to the old language. You know, because a lot of the arguments that I was studying in politics in the whatever it was in the mid-80s, if you're talking about Westland and you know that would be your essay on collective responsibility with Heseltine resigning, etc. What does that mean today? So why should we use that same language? We have to find a new language, and it's the same thing for religion as well. You have to find a new language that works. And the language that I see with a lot of teenagers is actually, and not just in this country, but in America as well. When you do the analysis of the people that voted for Obama as well, you know, young evangelicals, they're not angry. Their parents' generation was angry, they're not angry. You know, things like, you know, homosexuality, it's not a deal breaker for them. Doesn't really mean, you know, Hurricane Katrina and all those things were deal breakers for them, i.e. what did we do to help our fellow person. And I think so that they found a new language. We just have to find new ways of expressing what religion and conflict and all these things mean.
Andrew?
Well, 2 points. I think the discussion of literalism is interesting because a lot of Scott Atran is good on this. A lot of poor religious doctrines are literally nonsense, and I think this is very important about them. You know, I could go on for the idea of a religion that is completely rational and completely defensible, and where all the literal statements of it could be believed literally, it seems to me an absurd contradiction. So, you know, let's not dream of that. Let's try and use unclear but powerful symbols constructively rather than hoping to reduce it. If it could be expressed better than symbolically or more powerfully than symbolically, then we wouldn't need the symbols and we could go away and, you know, rewrite it as a computer program or something, but it can't, and that's what makes it interesting. The second point about this specificity, yes, of course, it's tremendously important, and I wanted to pick up on this idea that weak and fragile religious identities lead to violence more strongly. If you look, there's a flip side to that. If you look at 20th century Europe, if you were into nihilism, violence, and everything that we would now call fundamentalism, partly because it was a society with very strong, rich religious identities, you then were attracted to secularist ideologies. The interesting, I mean, so there is again this trade-off between the political and the religious, or this world and the next, or however you want to put it. That if you were given to messianic fantasies in Germany in 1920, you became a communist, or possibly a Nazi. You did not become a Teutonic Knight or whatever, which is interesting.
Okay, well, we're really nearly at the end, and what I want to do is to ask each of you to take a maximum of around 30 seconds to choose one, or if you can fit it in, at most 2 things that religion, organized religion, could and perhaps should be bringing today to the search for peace. Possibly in the UK where there are social conflict issues, perhaps in some much more obviously war-torn area, perhaps in a place which is transitioning from dictatorship to democracy, as we hope Myanmar is, with obvious conflict risk abounding all around as the political dispensation changes, perhaps at a much more sort of global and abstract level. I don't leave it very free for you, apart from the time constraint, which is about 30 seconds each, beginning with Fabio now.
Well, I think in terms of international affairs, religions can have a lot to say in different political contexts of the world as carrier of the ethics of really existing communities. And we in the West need to understand that. that there are different traditions, different normative horizons in other parts of the world, very often rooted in the religious traditions, and we need to bring them as part of the solution and not to think that they are source of the problem. And this is something that the West is continuously failing to understand, also with all intervention, and that's very high cost in my view.
Well, it was a profound thought, which is why you're allowed the extra 15 seconds. Rama, the bar is not low.
Excellent. I had a long short list, but if I had to choose two, it's been a tough choice. I would say, one, what religions have to do, and we have to ensure they do, is give up the tight embrace of power and go towards what our friend from Colombia said, embrace justice, which would mean embracing inclusion, which would mean embracing women and minorities and everything that's been thrown out, including nature. And the second thing would be what you and several others referred to, is making critical inquiry and reflection, including self-reflection, the key activity of if they want to be religious, and as well for the new or old atheists. That would be my top two.
Okay, this is getting like just a minute, isn't it? Aaqil, no repetition, no deviation.
I think just to remember that there are fun things in religion as well. And one of the things that shook me many years ago in doing the program was we were in Bosnia and we filmed with a multi-faith choir, which was put together by Jewish people, Christians and Muslims, and that's brought various different communities together. They worked together to rebuild a mosque. They did the same thing with a church. And so there are some powerful things in religion, but it's not always about scripture, and it's not always about speeches, etc. It can be the fun things, and actually singing in as an ex-choir boy, singing in a choir doesn't get much better than that.
I feel a moment to think about it. In 30 seconds, I think what religion can bring is a sense that there's something incomprehensible and irrational, but uniquely valuable about every human being, and that you share this most important quality about yourself, even with your enemies.
What a fantastic place to finish. I'm absolutely not going to sum up. You're all invited for a drink afterwards to carry on the conversation. Please can we thank our